All right, welcome. I'm Kevin Libuit, joined by Andrew Page. We're from Theogen, and this is the Bioinformatics Lab podcast.
Today, we will look at how large language models are changing the world. And by large language models, we actually mean, well, LLMs, and we mean things like ChatGPT, which I'm sure everyone in the world has heard of at this point. I saw a report today, and apparently a quarter of all adults have tried generative AI, which is pretty insane since it's only really come about to the masses like in the past few weeks. So Kevin, over to you. You have a little story for us.
Yeah, so I think to jump into the conversation of LLMs, especially as it kind of pertains to bioinformatics in our world of work here, I kind of wanted to start in this research paper put out by Stephen Piccolo over at BYU, where he was looking at this problem of, how is LLMs, how are LLMs going to be impacting the field of bioinformatics? It was interesting the way he kind of framed his paper, his manuscript, in that he was discussing how, actually getting access to bioinformatics talent or learning programming has been such a hindrance to so many different researchers. And his, I guess, kind of initial thesis there is that I think GPT can help us solve that, right? So the way he sort of went about constructing his study is that they had this intro to bioinformatics course that had pretty well-utilized prompts of programming problems of, from all the way from basic name a variable, do a couple, translate DNA to RNA type tasks, all the way to more complex things in their intro to bioinformatics course. And essentially, he just fed the GPT model, or rather, he fed the online GPT web application all these different questions and saw how it performed throughout. And I think on first pass, GPT was able to correctly code out in Python 75% of the exercises. And then after like a bit more of initial prompting or something like that, it was like 97% or so correct. It was able to, even on the ones that it failed, it was able to come to a resolve after a bit of like, hey, actually, did you think about this? Or try this approach with Python or whatever it is. Yeah, and like, as somebody who was reading that, I think I had kind of like maybe two frames of mind when I was reading that. I think there's a frame of mind that I have where if I was fully removed from this sort of GPT phenomenon and somebody kind of handed me these results, I'd be floored. I'd think, how the heck is there this GPT model that's already this capable of performing the things that, I've spent my whole career trying to equip myself to be able to do? Though there's also another aspect of me who's been involved in this now, or I guess more heavily utilizing GPT for maybe 3 or so months. And I'm surprised it only got 97%. I was like looking at some of those prompts, and I was surprised by the Stephen did a pretty good job in showing which exercises it failed on. I thought, oh man, that seems like maybe a couple more clarifying prompts could have gotten that solved as well. But nonetheless, kind of highlights how far these resources are, even in how far they've come and how applicable they can be, even to a field that is sort of as niche as bioinformatics. So curious on your end, like, is somebody who's been way more involved in machine learning for a much longer time than I have, was this the obvious conclusion to you? Does this seem like this, okay, we were heading here for a while in terms of being able to replicate bioinformatics with natural language prompts from your perspective?
Well, first of all, like the solutions that it gives, like, are insanely good. Like, it's not just that they are answering the question; they are answering it like an expert would, So it's that extra high bar, and it's going to be very difficult telling the difference between a student who's just done it themselves and actually someone who's actually spent a lot of time on stuff. And we use the same questions when hiring people as well, quite often in bioinformatics. You give them some problems and see, just to double check, are they actually knowledgeable in the area, or are they just, have they done a 10-minute course on it and they just know all the buzzwords but don't actually know what it means? Like, but for me, like I did my PhD in machine learning many years ago. And this stuff was always like just 10 years away, and it was always 10 years away, and we had all of these amazing algorithms and everything, but they were slow and they didn't really work, and they kind of worked in niche areas. And you had all these edge cases, like I know there's like famous ones where they trained neural nets on, say, X-rays, and what they found was, they even had this during COVID actually, was that, when they say trained it on X-rays to predict COVID, or severity of COVID, they found that, oh wow, this works amazing. It always predicts the correct answers. It always finds the people who are severe and people who aren't. But it turned out that actually all the machine learning was predicting was the person lying down because they're severely ill, or standing up when they're not severely ill, or was looking at the fonts on the X-rays themselves, and all these different edge cases, for many years, where you've had all of these problems, and it's kind of worked. And the experts in the field were like, yeah, we know we're, it's just within our grasp, but it's still 10 years away. And then suddenly, like in the blink of an eye, it's here. And it's not just here, it is everywhere. And it's going to have fundamental changes how we do everything.
And that fundamental change, I'm sure we're going to kind of talk about throughout here. But even on the onset, I don't know, I'm still kind of even wrestling with how I feel about it, because there's a component of me, when I first got into public health, I was at the Virginia Public Health Laboratory. They didn't have any bioinformatics, anything, but they were generating a lot of data. And I was tasked with, my first kind of deliverable there was get some kind of salmonella characterization workflow. And I remember I sort of trudged through learning. I even wrote it in Makefile, for what it's worth. So that was my first pipeline, was in Makefile. I learned it from Stephen Turner, and it just did everything that you would think it would do. It would do read processing, de novo assembly, pushed it through MLST, and then like serotype finder or whatever the tool was, and then got it, compiled all the reports into like a TSV or something like that. And in going through that process, it felt like so much pride. Like, I am a bioinformatics scientist, you know what I mean? And there's still that attached value of like, I am a bioinformatics scientist. So seeing that your works now that have taken me, some time to learn, and to some extent have attached value to, now prompted and it's done, even on a GPT that wasn't even specifically trained on bioinformatics, now being able to dominate, this at least intro level bioinformatics course is like, there's a funny,
and it's amazing. You now have like people that describe themselves as prompt engineers using this in their everyday work for everything, marketing and for tech stuff and for writing technical reports. And it's just amazing. Like it is very democratic, and it takes a very different skill to write a really good prompt for GPT or ChatGPT or Claude or whatever than it does to write the like technical software. It's pretty amazing, actually.
Yeah, and I think that would be the argument of like knowing some of the technical nuance. You no longer have to go through that same barrier to obviously, write even just the code, but having some of that basic knowledge allows you, as you said, first to write a good prompt, but then also correct it. I think that was one of the caveats too that Stephen had in this, is like, you're going to need some level, at least at this point, of expert approval, right? Like kind of like what you mentioned too. Do they have COVID? Was it proper diagnosis, or were they laying down? Right. Luckily, though, I think GPT, and this is kind of what we can kind of get into the next point, it's way beyond that of the models you're describing, right? Because of some, to my understanding, pretty groundbreaking new approaches to machine learning architecture. Is that a fair way to describe transformers, or how LLMs kind of differ from what was back then?
I mean, this came out of nowhere. Well, like computer science, to be quite frank, right, hadn't changed in decades. And finding something new in computer science was really, really difficult. And, it moves at a snail's pace, much like maths and that kind of stuff, and physics. So compared to biology and bioinformatics, which just goes a mile a minute, if you read a paper that's 5 years old, it's totally out of date. So what happened, I think, that caught everyone off guard was that in 2017, Google had this paper on transformers, and not the the toys that turn into robots, but like transformers as just a way of a different architecture for training neural networks. And not only that, you could go from sequential, which is where you can only do one thing at a time, to in parallel. And at the same time, there's a revolution happening with Bitcoin mining. So you had all of these people who wanted to run the same thing over and over again, which is mine Bitcoins for phenomenal amounts of money. And so companies like NVIDIA were creating graphics cards which just churn through this stuff, GPUs, and they were running servers. They didn't have a graphics interface on them, but they were high powered. They were very good at doing large numbers of calculations, the same calculations on the same stuff all the time. And so that meant that the GPU market was pushed ahead because so much money is flooding into that from Bitcoin, and like whole server farms of them. And it turns out that these transformers can run really well on them, and you can parallelize training stuff. You're not just doing a small number of things anymore. You're doing billions and tens of billions and hundreds of billions of things, and being ingested in at the same time. So that's kind of where that took off. And then suddenly you had a very incremental, you had one or two little models coming along, and then suddenly you had more, and then 2023, and it's suddenly they're everywhere, like GPT and Claude and all of these things. It just exploded.
And okay, so it's worth noting the name of that Google paper, because it's a bit eerie, right? It's called "Attention is All You Need." So there's a funny meme component to it that's like, oh, it's like, oh, attention is all you need. It makes me think, especially with like social media, it's like training it on all this attention has that weird kind of double entendre. But can you give a perspective from the machine learning world, like if at all it's possible to break down what a transformer is conceptually, and why it's so fundamentally different from maybe recurrent neural networks and whatever sort of machine learning methods were put in play before, and what is that jump? What is that 0 to 1 that we're talking about that we can't look back from with transformers?
God, I wish I could tell you totally, but I don't fully understand it either myself.
Okay, fair.
But fundamentally, right, the big difference is that instead of training something on, say, one word at a time, or or a small amount of data at a time, you're training on everything at the same time. And so the very first step is to take your text and turn into numbers, right? So they call this tokens. And you might have heard of this if you're using, say, ChatGPT, it'll only work up to a certain number of tokens.
Yeah,
and that's kind of what it is. Yeah, so it's roughly one word, one token, or sometimes it can be, if it's a longer word, it might break it into, the different parts of the word. And so then you have a big long list of numbers, an array of numbers, a vector of numbers, and you perform operations on those, mathematical operations. You put them into an encoder. Again, it creates more intermediate numbers, and within that you have your neural network. And neural network, you can think of it as, you have a few inputs into a graph, and then a few outputs, and then a black box in the middle, and it's a tangle and mess of wires being connected all over the place. And each of those edges are wires, gets a different weight, and magic happens. This is kind of how it works inside our bodies, but on a large scale. And then you have the decoder, which is kind of putting it all together. So that's where it can say guess the next word or generate the next word, look in the context, and then you kind of decode it as well. So it's all numbers in the middle, and we don't really know how this is actually working in the middle, which is going to make it hard for clinical applications, actually, because people like to know, why is that answer there? And you can't really tell, if there's a billion things going on there, like why does it work that way? We don't know.
But can it produce the reliable results? Because I think that's true to, that's going to be the interesting thing in terms of the biological application. And I'm curious too, like you mentioned the space of computer science being generally static, and then there's this big revolution that we're kind of like living through. But like you said, there's kind of been two since our like even just general working memory of sort of the crypto blockchain revolution there, and then also now what we're looking at in transformers. And it is kind of wild that they both have that overlap in the dependency on repetitive processing. All the while there's this one company kind of out there, people are rushing for gold. NVIDIA's selling shovels, right? They're the one company that have optimized for this exact purpose. And it wasn't obvious, at least to somebody who's so far outside of this, that GPUs are going to be the move, right? Because like whenever I was buying a computer or in the beginning, or even just a couple of years ago, it was CPU, memory, and then if I have a lot of friends who are in gaming, right, graphic processing units, GPU would be of concern. Now it's like, man, these things are hard to come by. because of the applications of mining and now in transformers here.
And I guess in our own space, if you look at base calling, I'd say on a nanopore or whatever, that uses GPUs heavily, and it does it in an hour instead of a week, which is kind of insane if you think about it. But under the hood, they use their own models as well. So my guess actually is that these large language models and the like are going to improve base calling. So I predict in the next year, nanopore bases are going to get a lot better. They're good now, they start off 90% accuracy, and now they're up at about 97, 98, and they'll go way higher.
And they already have made pretty big leaps and bounds, like one on their like physical chemistry side with the R10s, but then they've always been pretty willing to lean into that AI correction, having their models correct based on even, what is the chemistry you're using, what's the base calling model version, everything. Then they have their AI models to help correct for whatever squig patterns or anomalies might be in the data itself. And so I guess, that kind of brings us, obviously, like you said, 25% of adult humans on the planet, which is always wild when you still meet somebody who hasn't used GPT, which is almost like it's almost like a bit of a gift, like, oh, I cannot wait to show you what this thing is. But obvious applications in nearly every field. We already kind of highlighted how, as is, you could prompt it to write, at least to the extent of an intro bioinformatics course. I'd argue much further than that, and even just based on our given experiences and working together over the past couple of months here. Other bioinformatics applications. The code assistance to me is a lot of the big obvious one. It could be by means of just starting the prompt with GPT itself. Like I've done that a ton of times, like or the Copilot. I haven't used Copilot nearly as much as you have, because I did like the first 30-day trial, and it was at a time when I wasn't doing that much programming, so I never felt the need to kind of expound upon it. But I remember it feeling so much like GPT in that I could write a comment of the code block I was about to do or intending to write, and then it would write a function or whatever it might be kind of out for me. And it might even suggest, if I remember, it would even suggest different modules to import or something like this. It would predict how this could be done. And then even beyond that, you could toggle through its suggestions. Like it might do it a couple different ways. So well, what has your experience been so far with, is that the obvious application right now, is the code writing assistance, or maybe there's conversation of training more bioinformatics specific models so that we could have a different kind of interface with LLMs, but as opposed to GPT as it kind of sits on an LLM?
I think we're going to have a bit of both. So you're going to have, rather than going to like ChatGPT and OpenAI's website or to Edge and Bing Chat, it's going to be integrated into everything, like literally everything. I use GitHub Copilot Chat, which is like it's a beta version, so you have to use like the latest cutting edge Visual Code Studio. Visual Code
Visual Studio
Insiders.
Code.
Okay. VS Code Insiders. So it's like the nightly build kind of stuff. So it's a bit ropey sometimes. But so you have to use the cutting edge, and in there it's even better. Like it is phenomenally good, and it is ChatGPT 4 as well. And you have a little chat interface as well. So what I reckon I probably have sped up my coding by maybe 30-40%. Wow. And I've changed the style of coding now. At the very beginning of a class, like I'll write a big long text description of what I want, with typos, with everything like that. I'll copy and paste the first few lines of, say, input files, and then it knows what I want to do, and then it goes and just builds it. It's mostly right, and sometimes you have to guide it in a different direction, but it gets you most of the way there, and it saves a lot of donkey work. You type in the keyboard, just doing all the procedural stuff, and it's phenomenal. And then when you combine that with other things like, say, write the docs, which is another brilliant application, and that will generate all the comments in a nice set formats and things like that. So it's phenomenally good when it comes to programming, but it's gotten even better for data science. Have you used Code Interpreter?
You know what? When you showed it to us the other day, when you were we had some internal data and you were showing me how it compared, I immediately started trying it out. And I was even just grabbing data from online. You can get, there's like these big data sets and just seeing what it could do. So yeah, if you want to kind of briefly explain the code interpreter and how crazy intuitive it feels. Like it's as if you're speaking to a data scientist right by your side.
So like to give you context, this was only released 6 days ago. And it is now like my go-to feature in ChatGPT. So code interpreter, it basically means that you can upload files into ChatGPT. It can create Python and it'll run the Python for you and give you back results. So the most obvious thing to do is actually upload a spreadsheet or multiple spreadsheets and then ask it to do stuff to it. Vaguely, it might be, tell me something about this spreadsheet. It knows the context. So like maybe it'll read in the column names in your spreadsheet and it'll work out, okay, you've got species here, you've got NCBI. That must mean NCBI means, the National Center for Bioinformatics or whatever it's called in Bethesda. So it knows the context because you're talking about biological stuff. And then it knows, when you mention taxonomy, okay, we actually mean taxonomy of bacteria. And so it has the context there in its memory or however you describe it. And that's just phenomenal. So then you can go and ask questions. You can say, tell me something about this. And it'll go through and say, oh, this is, maybe summarized from columns or pull out interesting bits. You can tell it, okay, well, show me some graphs. And it goes and does it. Or you might say, here are 2 different spreadsheets. Can you, kind of merge them and then produce some graphs and then pull out some interesting stuff from them? And it will. And you can be very vague and it'll give you high quality stuff. Like within, say, 5 minutes, you can do work that maybe would have taken a data scientist maybe 5 hours, bashing a keyboard.
Yeah. And a full-fledged data scientist. Like these are strong figures. And I would say even, I don't know, maybe this is, given our perspective of it, but what's all the more amazing about it is then it gives you this sort of show your work, right? And you can see, oh, exactly how it did it. And then you can manipulate it. You can change it as you see fit, if you care to. Like the things that I've, at least thus far have seen about it. It's like, yeah, that's exactly. So long as I'm able to articulate my question in a clear way, I've seen nothing but strong results.
And if it makes an error, if there's an error there, it apologizes, right? And then tries a different way.
I'm always kind to it too. I think when you were first showing me it, when we were in England, you always put like the please and stuff, and I felt the same.
Yeah.
I every now and then I'll even say thank you, like afterwards, and it's just like you're welcome.
I did see a paper like where apparently, well, I don't know how true this is, but if you are polite to it, it'll actually answer better. And I guess it's because it's trained on a lot of data sets, public data sets where people are polite to each other, and so you're kind of linking into this human language.
And it's funny, this whole concept of like the Luddite and like these people who are losing their positions and this stuff. As much as I describe the bioinformatics experience I'm having here with, something that's been a core part of my professional character. It's like, oh, now it's being something that could quickly eat that up. I'm sure the data scientists are feeling that as well. There's a whole field of professions there. But ultimately, if I'm able to remove my personal self from it, it's a great thing, right? You want everyone. There's not enough data scientists. There's certainly not enough bioinformatics scientists. So it definitely, it allows so many people to overcome that barrier. And again, like I think Stephen Piccolo from that paper we opened up on, that was the kind of premise of his paper, is like so many people lack access to bioinformatics technicians or technical practitioners now. And often I think what he was saying is like sometimes they just need a couple of lines of code to help analyze their data. In the same way, some people have tons of data, that maybe even they've curated over years, but they don't know how to maybe clean it up, how to get it into RStudio or whatever, kind of scripting language is appropriate for them to actually just ask these questions, right? But they are themselves sort of prompt engineers, in that they want to know certain things about these data that these kinds of resources can help elucidate for them.
So much of data science isn't really doing the hardcore data analysis and pulling out stats. It's just munging data to get it from one format to another format to another format.
Yeah.
And that takes so much time. And this just automates it all. And it gives you the Python code so you can copy and paste it, which is just phenomenal. It means that we are changing position from being like, say, playing an instrument in an orchestra to being the conductor, and you can get so much more done quicker. It's not going to be a problem because there's so much data out there that data scientists couldn't ever analyze it all. So it's just going to make us more powerful.
And you brought up something about earlier that, the prompt engineering conversation is kind of running through my head, because I think bioinformatics, and you said it, on the tech world just being so male dominant in over the past, since it started here, but how it opens up so many more access points. So it's going to be so interesting to see even how like the academic space curriculums change here, because it's not just data science anymore. It's like, how do you speak with this thing? How do you interact with the language of it? So it invites more access points for crossover of people in different disciplines. You may not know anything about data science, but you can look at a large piece of data and ask it interesting questions, no matter what your data science background is.
Yeah, I remember doing my degree, like we'd have these shared courses where you'd have people from like music and like humanities coming in to learn programming for one semester. And it was difficult, very difficult for them, because they're in such a different mindset coming in, and then having to do programming with people who actually know how to program, and we're all talking different languages, but having prompts like this I think will revolutionize that, because they can learn it a lot quicker, but in something that they can reflect on in a manner that works for them, and they can have it put out answers that are relevant to their own work. They won't be just these esoteric computer science problems like a traveling salesman problem, which we know all about, but actually someone working in humanities or music would not. And so I think it's going to actually improve education overall.
It's going to be interesting, because I think we definitely benefit from living or having experienced both sides of the fence, in that we trudged through, we had those technical challenges, but we were able to kind of look at it with a critical eye. So like my wife and I, we play with GPT all the time, and we talk about it in the context of like writing essays or something. You could give it any prompt of everything we've ever done. You can write an essay in seconds. You can make it funnier. You can make it in the tone of what your favorite actor or actress or whatever it might be, and then you have that essay there. There's again that balancing that Luddite and still like technical first adopter sides in me of like, no one's incentivized to learn how to write an essay. Will people be incentivized to ever learn Python, right? Will the programming language ever even matter? You could imagine it developing another language, another programming language that's a bit more optimized maybe to the field, and you're asking it to write something and it shows you the code. There's no one any longer, or very few people, who can even make use of the show the work.
But I guess, we don't write code in assembly anymore, it's or very, very low levels. We have these higher level languages, very few people do programming in C. People are, much more the higher level, where they can get a lot more done. They don't have to worry about the finicky little things underneath. And maybe that's what's going to happen. But in terms of content generation, that's just changing the world. Like, I mean, why would you go and write a book now from scratch when ChatGPT can, knock out 100,000 word novel, in seconds? Well, not ChatGPT at the moment. Claude 2 can do that. It's got a context window of, or a prompt size of 100,000 tokens, which is insane. Like that's a whole book.
I've only really been working with GPT, and I guess really that's it. I've seen because even when you're on Bing, right, that's like still in the GPT built off GPT in that way. Are there things that are maybe more specific to the bioinformatics application? It sounds like Claude is just maybe more token space there, or
so
things that lend itself more to what we do here. Yeah.
So what happened was OpenAI kind of had a split. So OpenAI is not open. So that's a bit of a white lie there. It's absolutely not open. They don't tell you what to train their stuff on. You kind of get hints every now and again. Anthropic kind of was a split from OpenAI, and that's a rival thing to OpenAI. And on top of that, you have Claude, which is their equivalent of ChatGPT. And they've just released Claude 2. And again, that is like ChatGPT 4.
Yeah.
And so it's a rival, but it's really cool. I've been using it recently, and it's much faster at returning stuff. I presume that's because, you don't have 100 million people around the world hammering it all the time. It's less well known, which is great for me. And yeah, so that's kind of the space there. And then you have, obviously Google have about 20 different projects
Yeah.
on AI, and they're all in on AI. They really, really missed the mark there. So their equivalent is Bard, but Bard is like, in kindergarten compared to Claude and ChatGPT, which, are in high school, and they've missed the mark. So there is specialist large language models for certain things, but what you can actually do is you can build upon existing models. So if you go to Hugging Face, terrible name, huggingface.co, that's got lots of open source models there, and you can reuse those, and they have a lovely interface for just kind of downloading and reusing them and training them. Or you can kind of blank them and say, okay, I'm going to put my own weights on top of these. So a lot of the hard work is already done, and you can train on your stuff, or you can build upon what is already there. And that's going to be what's, a lot of applications will do. They'll say, okay, we've got this base of knowledge, or a base of how things work, and then we're going to put in, say, our company's data, just shove it in. Then we can have our own kind of private server. You can spin these up on Amazon, to give you answers back specific to your company, or say to an area. So there's a few biological ones out there. So some people say download it all of PubMed, because PubMed provides easy downloads, everything that's CC BY. And that means that you have access to all of that stuff. But the large language models are also trained on these as well. And that's obviously really awesome. But there is specific ones like GeneGPT from NCBI. Have you had a look at that?
I looked at it very briefly in that I saw it in the kind of pre-show notes here. So that's the extent of my understanding of GeneGPT.
So, I mean, what they do is they've made it very easy to actually work with the APIs from NCBI. And if you've ever worked with APIs, they can be a challenge, and particularly, for very complex systems like because NCBI provides so many resources.
Yeah.
It just makes it a lot easier to kind of drill down into these things and make it work, which obviously speeds up your entire life. And it just makes it easier for getting data in and out. So, that's an example of a really, really neat biological use case. And I'm sure we're going to see more of these, particularly when you have smaller models. You
Yeah.
can, put them in a web browser, put them onto a phone, you can actually start using them quite a bit more.
Have you used GeneGPT?
No, I only saw it yesterday.
Okay, solid.
This field changes so quickly, you
Yes.
don't have time to keep up with it.
Yeah, because I think a lot of us have definitely had some of the challenges in using that NCBI API. So like in Promise, I like it. How it actually translates to be determined, at least on my end. So I was wondering if you had some experience on that, but that will be interesting. And that even kind of brings me up back to the conversation about the research thing, because and every now and then you'll run into this whenever you're using GPT. You might ask it something of like relevant data or something like that is contemporary, something in 2023, and it gives you this huge disclaimer of like, hey, I can't say anything after I've been trained on materials that are from September 2021, and this is the extent of my knowledge. They had for a very brief time, I don't know why they took it out, but it was like a beta plugin for web browsing. I don't know if you saw that, but it's since been just removed. Obviously it was in beta, so maybe for whatever reason they found it inappropriate, but I thought it was very useful, because then you can search on things that were up to date. You can like kind of send it to a website, it would scrape it and kind of, integrate it into its model there. But the reason I bring that up is that's going to be really powerful for researchers, because you're not reliant on the sort of open AI people to retrain their model on the relevant research papers, which may take a ton of time, because they're not really just cared about the research papers. They want everything, which I'm sure is both time and cost intensive. Whereas if like kind of like what you were saying, if it's a little bit more narrow in its capture of materials, it could be updated a lot more frequently, and maybe even by the users to some extent. And with this, you're interacting with the API, so you can get it immediately.
That is the next step. And you can see companies like with vector databases, like Pinecone, they just exploded. They got hundreds of millions in investment there recently, because people were basically storing live data in them and then using it to feed into the large language models. to fill in this gap that you identified. And there are other projects like Auto GPT and Baby AGI, and these are kind of iterative things. They work with the APIs, and basically they store information and they build, better prompts, going around and around. You can give kind of a few goals, like go and do market research on, I don't know, shoes, and okay, now could you do men's shoes for trail running, and kind of really zoom down and get market sizes, and you can give all these different things, and they can go back and forth to the web and then back to ChatGPT and kind of interpret it, work it out, make better prompts, and then come back. And we used this actually at the hackathon we were at a few months ago.
Yeah, that was a blast. It was kind of a cool way to spend the time at the hackathon, because I think a lot of our day jobs were caught up in a bunch of different deliverables and pressures or whatever it might be. But then to have like, what was it, 2 or 3 days dedicated to explore GPT and all its little technical nuances, and you were in a little cohort of people kind of just trying to figure it out. Time well spent. I felt like I was like, oh man, I already felt like I was behind in looking at all the different projects that were kind of already proliferating in the space, especially with Auto GPT. At that time, it was like, and likely still is, like the most forked GitHub repo ever. And that had just come out or something at that time, and it was already the most forked repo historically.
Yeah, it is insane. Like, this field is just changing so rapidly. I know by the time this podcast comes out, like, we're going to be out of date.
Yeah.
even if it's only in 2 days' time, it's going to be out of date.
Yeah. Okay, so and then again on the it's hard to talk about large language models and GPT, and then even staying to the context matter of bioinformatics, right? Because it impacts so many different things. But like I'm always trying to figure out, okay, how do we reel this back into the bioinformatics thing? Because there are such really powerful revelations. We talked about already sort of the enhancement in productivity of your programmer, and you mentioned like a 30% boost in your efficiency, and I would say that's somebody who's spent decades in the field already, and you're already at a high level where I'm sure as you've improved your skills, you're already at a point of diminishing return. So for you to say 30% efficiency, I'm sure for most people it's like 50-60%, when it's like, I'm still trying to remember, I haven't used this library in forever. What freaking pandas function is this? It doesn't matter, GPT knows, or whatever, or so it might be even a greater boost of efficiency. We talked a little bit about Gene GPT as well, kind of like the literature mining, but there's all those other applications in bioinformatics, and I think because of my experience, I am kind of or I guess I have a disposition to look at like the genetic applications here. But when you look at bioinformatics in general, like, I don't know how you could take in like whole electronic medical records and draw some interesting insights in terms of patient risk, what's happening at the hospital, different efficiencies. I don't know if it can go as far as diagnostics, but it's going to be able to just see all these different points of connections that are not obvious for people looking out, even in the context of just the code interpreter. Like, if you can, EMRs, like, these are widely, and maybe it sounds wild to somebody in the UK and me being in the US, because all these things are so disjointed in the US. So like, even if you change providers, if you change job and insurers or something like that, getting your electronic medical records can be a pain. So they're all disjointed in all these different ways, but they're all standardized formats, right? So like, if you can carry these data with you, or for a whole hospital system, they have these massive data sets, the way in which they can now look at their bioinformatics that include genomic data, patient data, treatment history, doctor notes, right? Just the language of the notes, it has the potential to transform the insights a hospital has, therefore informing their action in a way that I don't think we've ever seen.
So like in the UK, we have a National Health Service, and in theory, it should all be joined up, but it's not. I mean, absolutely not. It's similar to different hospital systems in the US, I think, where people have bought different LIMS systems, different databases, different whatever. And unfortunately, sometimes with the interfaces, it can be a bit ropey, where people are literally faxing things, or emailing spreadsheets because there's no interconnection. And there is lots of projects, to link it all up and make these big data lakes and whatever. But, some things move very slowly. But I have heard of a project called CogStack from King's. So it's a spin-out from university, where they're using large language models to, read patient records and kind of join up data from lots of different systems in a kind of in an unorganized fashion, to try and make sense. And for that, like the primary goal there is, say, to identify people, say, for research projects. Maybe you're looking for people who have are at risk of diabetes, and they have particular, say, backgrounds or occupations, or kind of early markers, and you want these for like a clinical study. It's a good way of identifying those people, and you can go talk to them and say, would you like to be in prior drug or whatever, obviously in research context. But yeah, it is phenomenal. But you do have to understand, for some hospitals, say in the UK, like they are still at the level of writing notes and then scanning handwritten notes into PDFs, and it's just like, Jesus Christ, what are they doing? And like during the pandemic, we encountered this because we had a team of people just trying to find metadata on COVID patients and COVID samples. So like the hospital labs would be giving us stuff, and then we'd have a team of, say, 4 people looking at, a dozen different databases to try and pull in all the different bits of information we needed to then, go to samples to give to the public health bodies. And I was like, that's not the way to go. And that was only in 2021, 2022, not very long ago. But hopefully LLMs and things like this might make that job a little bit easier if they're allowed to run wild. But with patient data and PPI, maybe not.
And I think what we're highlighting here too is the value of well-curated data is going to be huge for this. And I think we're seeing a couple companies too in the biotech space where that is the asset of their well-curated data sets that could inform some of these LLMs that will make the practical application to people in our space. And maybe that's an aspect too worth exploring too, of like, with GPT, again, from my near layman perspective of, I've read a couple of articles in Twitter threads on, a major component that differentiating factor is the sort of human trained component of it, where there's like a bit of a feedback loop of kind of knob turning a little bit. That's about the extent of my understanding of it, but it sounds like, if you're training it on something with medical data, and you have those kind of SMEs in the field of medical practitioners that are helping fine tune these models, and you have that really well curated data set, you could start having these really specific nuanced trained models that have really high precision understanding of what's happening here, that could stay incredibly up to date, right? In terms of the literature alone, man, that can transform so many aspects of the clinical space. And even in that, I have such a temptation to even there's just further beyond just the clinical space of it as it relates to bioinformatics, right? We're obviously involved in the public health space, so that the applications there of those curated data sets, SMEs looking at these to kind of fine tune those models, the food safety world also being kind of well primed for a big impact of these kinds of technologies. It's hard for me to think of a industry that isn't.
So years ago, I remember seeing, this is just before global microbial identifier started up, or maybe it was around the time it did start up. But every slide you go to in a conference, everyone would have a slide of this satellite overview, of the world, and it was like, we need these high level overviews, looking at everything and scanning everything in real time and pulling all this information in. Well, that went nowhere because it's quite difficult to do, manually, and link up different databases and whatever in a structured manner. And particularly pulling in all the different resources. You can see little bits of it here and there, kind of work, but it's a really difficult problem. And particularly when you have combined it with, say, the well-traveled salad. Do you remember that? There was a slide that went around for 1 year as well, which was a salad bowl with all the different vegetables and where and fruits and where they came from, in the world, and just how complex supply chains are. And when you have a foodborne outbreak, where does it come from? Well, we don't know. We don't even know which thing caused it. Was it a tomato? Was it a pepper? Was it a cucumber? Who's to know? And because obviously, it takes a few days to make someone sick, and then, the food is long gone at that point. And so hopefully being able to take in all this different information in real time, we might see these signals earlier and better and pull them out. And who's to know what, how it'll improve things in future. I hope a lot.
Yeah, and it's cool doing this kind of podcast, kind of keeping our eyes on where the space is moving. Hopefully, being able to comment on it to some degree. I think this is a good first episode of just exploring LLMs in general. In kind of closing here, we're kind of running to the top of the hour here. We have been praising it because it's impossible not to, right? To look at how bullish the world is on these technologies. It's hard for me to even come up with something outside of maybe the, route to AGI apocalypse, component to this. But what are the cons to this? I guess maybe I talked a little bit about the Luddite conversation, not learning those basic skills, but I think that the value of this outweighs that completely of those concerns. So are there negative consequences that are obvious to you in the adoption of these technologies outside of maybe the things we've sort of discussed previous?
At the moment, it's all trained on, proper first generation data, if you think about it like that. But all of, because these generate content so easily, that's all going to be pumped out. And you can see it already, with fake books or AI generated books on Amazon, and, there'll be fake conference papers and articles, journal articles, and there'll be, all AI generated podcasts and all this. And that's going to be a second wave of vast amounts of content being generated. But then the large language models will be trained on that. So they'll be kind of reinforcing all of the errors and biases of the LLMs along with the human stuff. So actually the human generated content is actually going to have a premium. And I think actually it could go like that movie Idiocracy. Have you seen that?
Yes.
So we could fall down that hole, of
it has
Idiocracy, where we're all drinking electrolytes, and who needs water?
No one knows how to rebuild society. Yeah, okay, that's a good place to end on Mondo. It has electrolytes. Yeah, I like that phrase a lot. I think you said V1 data. That's going to be interesting. So yeah, the premium on well curated data, there always has been that, but in this case, because of how impactful things could be with LLMs, I think it's going to be all that much more important to understand what it's being trained on and how it's being biased. But yeah, great first episode.